much warmer, and so I know how
Lavanya
difficult it
talking
must have
about
been
her
to
book.
motivate yourselves to leave home. So thank you for that. Now, as for where the book started at multiple points. It didn't come to me fully formed in a single sitting or anything of that sort. I think there were two significant points of origin for this book. Now, I am a food aficionado. I love to cook, I love to eat, I love to taste new things. When I'm traveling, I like to immerse myself wherever I am by eating all the local food. But at the point where this book really started, I was really ill and I was recovering from an illness, and I'd completely lost my appetite. And the only thing I wanted to eat was rasam rice, very specifically made by my grandmother. I'm Tamilian, so rasam rice is a staple and it's a great feel-good food. Now, as this sort of nourished me back to health, me, this food enthusiast who, binge watches MasterChef to de-stress after a long day at work, I started thinking about why I'd never seen certain types of foods that I'd eaten around the world, especially in India, anywhere in the public imagination. I started thinking about why certain foods become popularized, what that process might be like, and why they catch fire in a more global imagination versus some foods that are really limited and constrained and remain with their native cultures. And this sort of led me down the rabbit hole into doing a ton of food research. And this was just with no agenda. I wasn't thinking about writing a book or anything of the sort at that time. But the more I started to read about food cultures and food histories, it started to strike me that food culture mirrors so much of our history as humanity, not just in terms of, our evolution from hunter-gatherers to fire transforming the way we lived as a civilization, to the agricultural revolution and what that brought us. I started looking at the political climate of food. At one point, salt was the most valuable commodity in the world, and wars were fought over salt, and now it is this banal thing we take for granted. But just 70 years ago, or more rather now, Mahatma Gandhi led a protest so that we could have salt. And there is so much of the political climate of the world reflected in food cultures. Even if we look at India today, we're looking at this rise of almost militant veganism. And to talk about food itself, or to talk about the world, one might as well start talking about food. And that's when I thought I should write a book. And then I decided, why not throw it in space? And the reason that was a conscious decision, because what I wanted to do was not just write about food as political, but also invent the mythologies of food that we kind of tell ourselves at home. Every single dish has its own history that's both personal, but also a bigger part of the culture one belongs to. And I thought it would be really fun to start inventing those mythologies for a far future civilization. And that's where the book really began and started coming together.
There's lots of layers, right? The character work is lovely, their relationships are lovely, the story moves along a little bit. It's very immersive, very richly described. So as I was reading it, one of my questions was, and obviously, you discuss the role of food a lot. Food as culture, food as politics, food as both kind of linker and separator as people. And you told us just now why, this could just have been a food book. And you've told us why you decided to move it to the far future, to space, right? So what I'd like to ask you instead is, tell us a bit, give us a little introduction to the world you actually created. You took, I guess, 140,000 or so words to do it, but I will very reasonably say give us a listicle style guide to all your work instead, or as a prelude maybe. Yeah.
So this world, this far future world, is approximately 2,000 years in the future. Earth has been through a very rough time. Pretty much all the things that are wrong with our planet today and with the worst of humanity that exists on this planet today. It has seen it through to the end game. Things have gone horribly wrong, and people have attempted to learn their lessons. And as part of that, they decide to go out into space. Now, of course, it's in the far future, so technology has advanced. Space travel is possible. They decide to create these new philosophies and ways of being and settle other planets. And I say settle very intentionally. It is not colonize. It is only to sort of belong to the planet and take only what is necessary from the planet to sustain humanity. And in that regard, these people call themselves the Nakshatrans. They head off into space. They settle this planet Primus. And Primus is a wonderful welfare state. There is universal basic income. All its citizens are taken care of. They have this motto to tread lightly, which is not to, disregard the planet or the land. They have people whose job it is to maintain these vast tracts of the pristine natural environment. They have been very careful with transplanting things from the earth. They have not terraformed. So they're a really respectful bunch. But having said that, all of this truly, I think, fundamentally good philosophy that they attempt to embody also starts to turn them into extremely self-righteous people. And they judge the rest of the universe for not being as virtuous as they are. And as part of the rest of the universe, the Earth is judged extremely severely because they sort of view themselves as having been forced to leave it to find a better future elsewhere because of how messed up the philosophy underlying the lifestyles on Earth were at the point of their departure. And so you have this sort of clash of philosophical outlooks which leads to a lot of stereotyping and a lot of xenophobia and a lot of protectionism, really, because what they are attempting to do is to cement their place as the leading philosophical perspective on how to be good people in what is a very populated universe now. And that creates a lot of, I think, tension and a lot of the dynamics through the book.
Additional complexities in being a speculative fiction writer, both in India and from India and the West, because the expectations are very different from each place. So you have to walk this interesting tightrope between, creating writing that ideally should work for people who don't see themselves as speculative fiction readers, and for people who absolutely see themselves as speculative fiction readers and believe that involves meeting certain checklists and benchmarks, right? So one of the things that I really appreciated about Interstellar Megachef is that there is a lot of very complex world building. There's a lot of very layered social commentary and all of that, but it is really presented in a way where people who do not have context for far future stories or for space stories are able to kind of flow through it, because you do your kind of all this information that you gave us in an info dump, and an info dump is just a passage of exposition that is best avoided because people have lives and they don't want to read all this stuff put in one go. But since I suspect since we're in the library and I suspect a fair number of the people here are writers, I want you to tell us a bit about how you approach this thing where where you're looking at a large set of complicated information that you need the reader to digest, but you're also able to do so much character work and kind of slip in the information. So just tell us a bit about your process there.
So it was really tricky. I am not a fan of info dumps at all, and I apologize for giving you one right now.
I made you. You weren't going to do it, yeah.
When I was writing it, this was something I really wanted to avoid. When I write something that I attempt to do, and this is very, very, I think, key to my process is to not pontificate. I don't want to take the moral high ground and tell people who are reading how they're supposed to be thinking or feeling and what good and bad is. And as part of this process, I decided that I would create these morally very ambiguous protagonists who take the story forward. Each of them, of course they have their motivations and, in and of themselves, they are entirely justified in many of the things that they're doing, but they are morally ambiguous. And by creating these sort of contradictory women who come from very different perspectives, Saraswati Kaveri is an earthling, and so she's frequently subjected to all of the xenophobia and stereotyping. And Serenity Ko is from the planet Premise, and she is a tech wizard. And she comes with all of the entitlement that one just embodies naturally when one is part of a dominant culture, and she's not a particularly reflective person. So she's highly unaware of the position of privilege that she occupies. And in sort of throwing them at each other and making their paths cross, through that dynamic, I sought to kind of explore all of these aspects of the world by throwing them in situations that would expose these aspects of their personality or these experiences, and through that kind of bring this culture of Primus, this perspective as being the center of the universe, the moral compass of the universe, if you will, to light. And one of the ways I did it, I think, as a writer, I thought I wanted to throw Saras into the deep end of experiencing xenophobia. And when we talk about food cultures, again, coming back to that, she goes to Primus to take part in a reality cooking show. Now, growing up, watching a lot of these MasterChef things, right, before I was traveling the world and experiencing things in real life, watching reality TV was often a gateway to seeing foods other than the ones that I was familiar with, or the foods that were available in a city like Bangalore or in a city like Hyderabad. So I figured, let me throw her onto the show and have things go horribly wrong for her because she's cooking her native food, which is an unacceptable food form on this planet. And that's really where that jumping off point began in terms of starting to explore the dynamics of this world without necessarily info-dumping, all of the different, I think, philosophical and moral perspectives that come into play through the book.
Set of reviews that you got for this was that, Lakshminarayan argues that utopias are inherently reactionary, adverse to change, and incapable of self-reflection, right? So, we've discussed world building. You're juggling a lot of themes in this book. So, at what point of time did you realize that you were arguing that utopias are inherently reactionary, adverse to change, and incapable of self-reflection? And how did you manage to not info-dump that? Because it does come across in the book, but you don't hammer us on the head with it. But, it's also interesting to me because your first book, The 10% Thief, or Analog Virtual, which is what the Indian edition is called. Please read it, everyone. It is really, I know you were in the pandemic at a time, and it's a book that won prizes, so it's unfair to say that it didn't get that much attention, because it did. She won at least 2 prizes, and now it's in 50 languages or something. And Clark Award, so, I did fine. But I have not seen in many years a kind of a sort of science fiction mosaic novel casually set in a future Bangalore, and it's been labeled dystopian throughout. I don't think it's dystopian, I think it's just social realism really. But to go from that to what is presented initially as a utopian society before we see the cracks in it, tell us what that is like. I know that, your Primus is just as utopian as Future Bangalore was dystopian earlier. It's much more complicated, but what was the shift like for you?
So I started writing it actually as a hopeful utopian future for humanity. Because having written the not so dystopian really, the social commentary that was in my first book, Analog Virtual, or The 10% Thief, I wrote that book before we went into the pandemic, and a lot of the themes that I went into in that book were reflected in the pandemic when all of us had to move to living very virtual lives in a lot of isolation. And those, we were the ones with privilege, and there were so many people without privilege going through absolutely unimaginable, horrific experiences through the pandemic. When you write a book, you never want to be a prophet of doom. You actually hope that humanity will do better, and you write books like this as a warning. It served to be a far more immediate mirror to our reality than, a far sharper mirror, really. It was a bit of a hazy mirror, and I figured, we're still a few decades away from this being an absolute reality, except we weren't. So I really wanted to write a hopeful future for humanity, and I really, with much earnestness, set about trying to create this this beautiful planet that's encouraging of equal rights for all, that's open in its perspective on what it really means to be human, what do relationships mean, who really are we? But then as I zoomed out, I created this planet and I created its culture, and I started zooming out and viewing the rest of the universe. And I realized that there can never be true equality, and I'm really an optimist. But I feel like our innate humanness wants to assert a certain superiority or a certain rightness as a way of being. And when I started zooming out and viewing the rest of the universe relative to Primus, I realized that they were going to look down upon the Earth from which they came. They were likely going to look down upon a lot of the rest of the universe because, cultures progress at different paces. Human beings have differences of opinion. That's one of the most beautiful things about who we are. But when you occupy a dominant position, and they don't occupy a dominant position through military might, through economic might, it's none of those things. They just happen to be the planet that was settled first. And they had the longest lead time into developing their dominant culture and propagating it across the universe. So when you have the power of this soft power, right, that you are perpetuating across the universe, there can be no equals. You are very much the heart, and that's when things started to fall apart, and I realized, okay, so much for utopia.
This is a great time to tell all of you that a lot of this book is really funny. In addition to everything you've heard. As I said, it's got a lot of layers. Thank you for that. Analyze the human race for us in the last few seconds, but I want you to talk a bit about the non-human people in this book, because in the middle of all of this, there is a lot of, I guess, what one ordinarily would call alien, though that's not the right word in this case, and non-human artificial life forms in them, which you clearly had a lot of fun with. So just give us a few examples of what they are and how you name them, because I love the naming systems.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Also to reiterate, this book, does have its lighter moments. I know we've meditated a lot upon the human condition, but there is lightness in the book.
No, but there is a real space for, we're all doomed. This is a comedy, which the book does do in large parts. Yeah.
No,
sorry, go on.
But thank you. Because part of the whimsy was including all of these other beings, and I had a lot of fun with them. There's the Anemon, and they're sort of very advanced, inspired by octopi. They are a collective consciousness. One of the characters' names is Starlight Fantastic. I had tons of fun naming them. And they're just this wonderful chromatophore being from another part of the universe. They're a really, really ancient species, and I hesitate to use the word species. I'm just using it here for clarity. But in the world of the book, species is a very top-down derogatory word to refer to them. They're beings, they're people. And so the Anemon are a really ancient being. They've started wars in the past. They've learned their lessons. They're one of the ancients, if you look at them that way. There's the Banar, and they tunnel through space, so they create space tunnels, and they're also very enthusiastic chefs. And they kind of wear these mechatronic, they've kind of biomodified into these mechatronic things so that they have limbs to do all of this. So they're very, I would say, sort of cyborg, except not human cyborg. I had fun creating those. There's the Kartritva, they're sort of insectoid, again, derogatory in this universe, but saying it out loud for clarity. They're a bit of a hive mind, and they will come into the sequel as well and play a bit of a role there. So these are just some of the species, or beings. The names like Anemon, Going Off Anemone, and yeah, played around with that.
So by now everyone is wondering how you became like this, right? So tell us a bit about your life before you made the foolish and beautiful decision to start writing very successful books. One of the things about Lavanya is that has anyone here not played either Mafia Wars or Farmville? It's in Mafia Wars that you are an actual character, right? Yeah. So one of the characters that you saw on your screen while you were scrolling past and pretending to work was her. So yeah, tell us a bit about your life before you became a writer and how you feel it helped build you into what you are today. I mean, and what do you miss most, apart from the money?
So I actually always wanted to write. When I was 8, I decided, in that first composition that you write in school, I said, when I grow up, I want to be an author. And everybody encouraged me, so they doomed me right at the start as a very impressionable child. And, but one thing led to another right out of college. When I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, I still wanted to write books. I just knew I was not ready to write. I felt like I hadn't discovered something that I really felt was relevant enough to say that would make writing something meaningful. And in order to kill time, I had this wonderful opportunity to work in games. And I started working, one of my earliest games that I started working on was Mafia Wars. And I went on to work on Farmville and the sequel to Farmville, which was called Farmville 2. I had a ton of fun. I did a ton of things in games. I was sometimes, when I first started out, I think I had 3 jobs all at the same time. I was a social media manager and a producer, which is like a project manager in gaming, and a writer and a game designer. So, well, that's 4 jobs actually. So I've done a lot of things in games, and I had the time of my life doing that, I did those games for a bit. I've worked in augmented reality. I've done things that are very Snapchat equivalent for the Indian market, built a ton of apps. At one point, I was building a robot fighting game in my living room that used augmented reality, and my friends and I were actually 3D printing our own robots. So, I mean, I've always been a bit, you can see where some of this book comes from. I just had a lot of fun dabbling in all of these disciplines kind of crossing over each other and blending together, and always doing it from a storytelling perspective, like how can I get people to play this random game by getting them invested emotionally in it. So these were all the things that I did before going off and writing my first book. And at the point when I decided to write my first book, I felt like I'd seen beyond the veil into big technology, and I'd seen a lot of very bleak things, and I had to talk about it because it is, of course, fun and it's light when you're doing it for games, it's entertainment, but there are also so many far starker purposes that all of this tech and data is used for, and that started to disturb me a lot. So that's when I decided to go off and write. But I learned a lot that I took into writing. I think I learned how to de-romanticize the creative process a bit. Because it's beautiful having ideas, and it's beautiful being in flow and waiting for the right moment to write. But that's also not a very productive way to write. It's a really slow way to write. If I were to sit with a cup of tea and wait for that perfect moment when it starts raining outside to start writing, I would write very few days of the year. And so working in games kind of told me that I had to show up every day. And the words might come, the words might not come. But it is enough to show up, and you just have to give it a try. The other wonderful thing that I learned was how to let go. Because in games there are always deadlines. Writing is very different, and you can polish and edit and revisit your draft endlessly. But where do you, at what point do you say this is okay? This is ready for a second pair of eyes for somebody else to look at. I learned how to draw that line in the sand in games. So when I'm drafting, for example, at the point where all I'm doing is looking at my draft and playing with synonyms, at that point I know, somebody else can look at it and I can get a second opinion.
It's both inspiring and depressing that this is you taking it easy. The writer life you imagine and the writer life you have.
Okay, so the writer life I imagined was a lot more, cabin by a lake writing Walden. The writer life I have is a ton of, I think, constant everyday distractions. You know what? You learn that you can't actually write in isolation in a cabin in the woods anymore. It's just not feasible, or you really have to be willing to drop off the grid for a while to do that. And maybe I'm just not willing. One of the things that hit me very early on was how expansive time is. I worked in gaming. It's a frenetic industry. It's lunacy. Most of the time, everything was needed 2 weeks ago. And to suddenly have, all the time in the world where there's an entire support system, wonderful publishers and your fellow writers saying, it's okay, you can take a break. Just take your time to get through this or to examine this this idea you have from every possible angle. Magnificent. I love that.
So, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from you guys. Yeah. Tell us as much as you can about the sequel.
Okay, so to head into the sequel, I have to tell you a little bit about this book if you haven't read it. Basically, Serenity Co. and Saraswati Kaveri cross paths, and they start working on this thing that will revolutionize the future of food. And it is a food sim, so it simulates flavors and tasting experiences and all of that through some very advanced virtual reality and a lot of very futuristic science. But they invent this with all the best intentions to really do something innovative and to really put their mark on the universe. Unfortunately, things don't always go according to plan. These are just two very small people against the scale of the universe. And all of the technology that they're building will have consequences, for better or for worse. And that's what's going to be dealt with in the sequel.
I have another thing I want to ask. You've worked on international projects out of India in gaming and in books, right? So, the gaming world is much more organized and the book world is much more vibes-based. I want you to tell us a little bit about, the differences in the experience between publishing here and just in terms of the kind of responses you get from both places and the way that people read the same work differently given their differences in point of origin or point of view.
Oh, so that is interesting. I mean, in terms of publishing itself, I think Indian publishing works way faster. Publishing in the UK and the US is a much slower process. Books are signed and they come out years later, and over here it is much quicker. But in terms of, the way a work is read, I do think that over here in India, we have this huge advantage, especially when it comes to speculative fiction, that we are not weighed down or burdened by this history of its origins. If you look at the United States, it starts off as pulp. It's very stylized. It's a genre unto itself. There are certain rules and guidelines within which things are expected to be written. You don't always have to follow those rules, but there is an expectation that certain checkboxes will be hit. There will be tropes that are addressed, that will feature in your work. We aren't burdened by that at all as readers. And so I sometimes find that when I hear from Indian readers or Indian editors, though my editors in the UK are fantastic as well, but I do believe there is a lot more openness to receiving a work that does all of this. There's political heavy lifting, there's a reality TV show around food, there's food as a political theme, as a personal theme, and there's a ton of whimsy. And I think I just feel like as an audience, because we don't go into bookstores with genre categories and preconceived notions of genre in our heads. We are open to that kind of playfulness, possibly a lot more than, in the West, where you walk into a bookstore and there are genres and subgenres and sub-subgenres, and each one carries or connotes a very specific idea. I don't know what my book is being labeled right now, Interstellar Megachef that is, but the first book over here was dystopian fiction and satire. In the UK it was cyberpunk. It's something else, in somewhere it was solar punk. There was some country it released in and it was called solar punk because there's also a lot of hopeful technology. And I just feel like we don't really do those labels over here. And that's actually fun. And I think that also informs the writing. Because I don't go in there thinking I am writing this space opera, even though technically this can be called space opera. That's not what I was thinking. I was thinking, I'm writing a book about food, it's in space.
I think if you write for long enough, you will see your book in every possible section of the bookstore. And I mean, if you can find the data on this later, I feel there will be a definite sales spike if they accidentally put it in cooking. Because people head for that section, they really do. Okay, so I'm gonna open this up. If anyone has a question.
I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things that I was very keen to do while writing this was sort of shift humanity out of our present focus on ourselves. We are very anthropocentric right now, and just by introducing other intelligent life that is non-humanoid, I mean, they forget, human, they are way beyond non-humanoid. I wanted to shift us out of being anthropocentric in this book. And kind of, like you said, right, like relegate us to being just another intelligent species in a very vast and populated universe. I do think this is sort of in the space of ambiguous utopia, because that is something that I was keen to put in there, but I also think this is rather whimsical science fiction. So it's kind of hard to find one specific category to place it in. Somewhere it leans in a bit into Douglas Adams territory with the whimsy. There's satire, but it's also social commentary, which Douglas Adams does. But on the other hand, there's, I think even in a lovely review in Locus, Ian Mond compared it to Adam Roberts' Lake of Darkness. So I think that blend of ambiguous utopia, but it's also a whimsical read, is where I would place it firmly in those spaces. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Well, that's the book we are talking about with the author.
Yeah.
Hi, Lavanya.